Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for dialing in from Europe. I know it's late for you. Mario, can I share my screen?
Yes, there is on the bottom share screen.
Yes. Okay.
We can see it.
Wonderful. So my name is Katya Klinova. I work for an organization called Partnership on AI, which I'm gonna introduce in a moment. And I'll talk to you specifically about my work around making sure that the gains from AI advancement do not get all concentrated in just a handful of hands or a handful of companies. So the Partnership on AI, we call it PI for short, is a coalition of now around 100 organizations. Most of them are civil society, nonprofits, human rights organizations. A lot of them are also technology companies developing AI, and we have some academia. And all of these organizations, and these are some of the, skipping the slide was members. So all of these organizations are coming together to think about how do you, in practice, implement the responsible and ethical AI principles that you might have heard a lot of organizations have published in the recent years. So the principles that they've published are, for example, that AI should be explainable. So you should be able to tell why AI made a decision such and not something else. AI should be transparent, accountable, should not be biased, so technology should not be racist, and many others. And so all of those principles, they sound very nice and they're like definitely the right things to proclaim, but what should be the difference in the operation of you as a company once you've passed the principle like this? What should you be doing differently is not usually a trivial question, and this is what we are grappling with, and the practices that we are developing are centered around these responsible AI principles. So what we do is we conduct research, we facilitate debates and disagreements on these topics, and we create resources and educational materials that we publish and that we recommend for the industry to use and follow. These are some of the projects that the partnership is currently working on. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you know they are dedicated to these various topics that I was just mentioning. You know, for transparency, for example, there is a development of a standard. How do you document what kind of data an AI model is using, what goes into that model? There are projects on media integrity, for example, so they're looking at detection of deepfakes and things like that. And then I lead our work on everything that has to do with impact on labor and economy. So this is what the majority of my talk is going to be about, but like if you want to ask about the general PI as well, I'll leave definitely time at the end for that as well. So the project I'll talk about is called AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative. It's a fairly new one that we are starting out. And this one calls to define the responsibility of the AI industry when it comes to making sure that their actions do not contribute into exacerbation of inequality, but the opposite, support shared prosperity and inclusive economic growth. So some of you might have heard about fairness, transparency, and accountability efforts, and this is where the majority of work has concentrated so far when it comes to AI impact on inequality. And those are so-called microeconomic impacts, micro not because they're unimportant, but because they can be isolated on an individual level. If you think about, for example, bias in hiring, you know, someone might have, their resume might have gotten filtered out because they belong to a certain race or gender, or similar outcomes for, let's say, access to credit or admission decisions. And so these are very important negative consequences that should be tracked and should be contend with and companies definitely should be thinking about how to make sure their technology is as unbiased as possible. But at the same time, there are other effects that are also possible, even if your technology is theoretically completely not biased. And those have to do with with the phenomenon of skill bias, which is an aggregate shift of labor demand away from people without college degrees and towards people with very specific set of college or graduate degrees, such as data science and things like that. So usually, this would not be something new because automation has been around for hundreds of years, and it's always just like a natural path of technological progress that some tasks that humans do get automated, but there are also new tasks that get created for humans. And as long as these processes kind of balance out on net, more or less, we still have, we both have economic progress, but also we have enough employment for people. But then in the last three decades or so, at least in the US and in parts of OECD where this research has been done, what we're noticing is that there is an outpacing of automation comparing to creation of new tasks for humans. This is research that has been done out of MIT and the Boston University by Achimolu and Restrepo, for example. What they're also pointing out is that when the phenomenon becomes not just about the pace, but about automating the kind of tasks that people without college degrees could perform and could earn their living with, and the new tasks that get created, they're no longer for them, but they require college degrees or master degrees, then you are creating potentially a surefire path towards deepening inequality. So this is what we're trying to contend with in this project. And if you've been following at all the future of work, so-called future of work debate and scholarship, there's a lot of there's kind of an implicit assumption there that innovators are just going to innovate and they're going to reshape the kind of skills that are valued by the market. Some skills are going to become obsolete, but the society just needs to adjust to that. And some of the adjustment mechanisms that are being prescribed is, for example, that workers need to continuously upskill themselves to keep pace with technology and to make sure they remain relevant in the market, or governments need to support people with stronger social safety nets, provide things like universal basic income and such. And none of this is wrong or bad. Like, we absolutely support all of that, but we feel that it might not be enough if workers are at all times kind of competing and trying to keep pace with technological development. So what this initiative is asking, how could we, instead of asking society to adjust, how could we adjust the path of technology to meet workers where they are in terms of their skills and create earning potential for them where they are without asking them to go get a data science degree or undergo 1,000 hours of retraining and things like that. So this is shifting the burden of adjustment away from the society and onto innovators and the industry developing and deploying AI. So this is the practical focus of this initiative has actually equipped the industry with a framework for handling the redistributive power of AI responsibly. Because if you're calling on the industry to do that, you need to be able to give them tools to act on that. So if you think about, for example, environmentally responsible business. Right now, if you're called to make sure your operations are green, it's very clear what kind of goal you need to set for yourself. That's, for example, zero emissions or reduction in emissions. It's clear how you can measure the emissions you're producing. And there are concrete frameworks and concrete steps around, for example, waste management or energy management that you can adopt as a business to make progress towards a goal like this. Now, if there is a call for you as an AI business to ensure that the AI you're producing does not create more inequality in the world, it's actually very unclear what that means in practice. Like, what kind of goal would be the right goal for you to set for yourself? How would you measure that you're making progress towards that goal? What steps you actually take to make progress like this. So this initiative is developing exactly these conceptual tools for companies to be able to take on a responsibility like this and act on it. And this is actually what this slide is covering that I just talked through. Then, in practice, when you are in an early stage of imagining a new AI product or developing and testing one, the kind of question that we want you to be asking yourself is your innovation enhancing or undermining the value of human labor, and in particular, labor of people without college degrees? Are you shifting relative demand for skills, again, away from people with less privilege and towards people with elite kinds of educations? Are there potentially spillover effects into other countries? So maybe the innovation you're producing in the US, where there is a shortage of labor, for example, for specific occupations, but once you've automated, say, an airline check-in counters or an order kiosk at restaurants like McDonald's, does it also get spilled over into other countries that have high unemployment, that have young populations in need of jobs, and those jobs get automated there just because once the technology has been invented, it gets deployed everywhere around the world. So these kinds of shifts we want innovators to be thinking about as early as possible at the stage of development and the stage of deployment of technology. So let me stop here to make sure that we make space for a discussion and for me to answer any questions. Don't want to make it into totally a lecture. If you can also find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, just my name. Please feel free to get in touch as well.
Thank you. Any questions? Maybe I have a question, Katya. When we were talking about ethics on AI, you mentioned biases, racial bias and so on. Can you give us an example of what has come up, and is this something that can be avoided, or is this always something where we basically are in this dilemma that we will never be able really to fix that?
So there are a couple of sources of bias in the resulting AI system. There can be bias because underlying data is biased. So for example, if historically, you've been hiring mostly men, for example, or mostly women, especially in a leadership position, then your underlying data is going to suggest that if you've been mostly hiring women, then women are more likely to succeed in the workplace. And then, an algorithm you can be deploying on, say, a set of resumes can just assume that because this is historically the only thing that it has seen. So that type of bias is a little bit easier to fix because you could presumably, if you're looking carefully at your underlying data and the historical data and you're spotting what kind of bias there is, you could correct for that. But bias can also, any AI system is not just a technical system, it's a socio-technical system. It's created by humans, it's used by humans. And so there can be bias introduced into it just because of the design choices that were made by biased humans, implicitly or explicitly, intentionally or not. And those can be much harder to weed out. And this is why researchers usually say that, do not assume that just because you carefully looked at your data, now you've completely unbiased your system, and you should still be carefully monitoring its performance and defining fairness criteria and making sure that those fairness criteria they stay met as the system gets rolled out.
Maybe one more question to that, because I'm reading right now on these past disruptions, you know, like in Britain in the 18th century, when the power looms, the weaving systems came in and replaced high-skilled jobs. Basically, the people working privately, they had high skills, and then they were replaced basically by these machines that were operated by children for half the salary, and or even for nothing. Yeah, and then we had 100 years later machines that needed skilled people. So suddenly there was more negotiation power for labor, and everyone benefited from that. And now it's kind of confusing with artificial intelligence. What we hear is, on the one side, it looks like it's labor replacing, like, for example, truck drivers, taxi drivers are replaced by robot trucks and robo taxis. But then others say it may be actually enhancing labor, not replacing it, but enhancing it, making the jobs less monotonous. What was your opinion about that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So not all automation is alive, let's say. And so context really matters. What you just said about industrial revolution, indeed, like a lot of automation has happened. For example, in agriculture, it used to be the case that like 98% of population was employed in agriculture. Now in developed countries, that's like 2%. So it was a massive dislocation by automation. At the same time, new opportunities were being created simultaneously in factories, in which, as you said, it was actually de-skilling innovation. So the kind of innovation that would allow people to come in from farms to factories and produce altogether an automobile. So their productivity was boosted tremendously by this technology. And it was the kind of technology that was creating employment opportunities and earning potential for people without asking them for like special educational preparation or like very lengthy training. And that in the beginning, that was also accompanied by a lot of labor right abuses. Like labor rights kind of didn't exist, and this is where there was a big push to get those created. So like regulation is 100% very, very important in this process. So now what we're seeing is a little bit of a reverse process. So it's not a de-skilling innovation, but upskilling innovation. So the kind of innovation that potentially reduces opportunities for people with lower levels of educational attainment. So that is worrisome, because in many countries, the level of educational attainment is correlated with income of parents and with privilege and wealth. Right, so that you are deepening, such innovation can deepen existing inequalities. Now, what you said about augmenting technology, this is now a very fashionable idea in some ways. And like, it's a very good idea, because indeed you can, if you can automate parts of a job that are difficult, like physically demanding, dangerous, dull, maybe boring, then you're potentially freeing people's time and resources to focus on the more creative parts of their job, where human, ingenuity, empathy, and things like that are needed. But the net effects of that are unclear. Here's why. So maybe like on an individual level, you made my job a little bit easier. I don't have to lift something heavy, and like I'm pleased by that. But if parts of the job got automated, maybe like you are now able to fire some people, or like not hire as many people as you would in the future. Or maybe not even that, but imagine, so you with a technology like a tractor, you were employing 20 people and you made them a lot more productive. So now you could, for example, you made them 20 times more productive. So your choice as an employer, either to like fire 19 of them, or maybe produce 20 times more. So the real question becomes, can the market, like, will there be demand from consumers to buy 20 times more bread that you are producing? If the demand is elastic, so if there is a capacity to consume a lot more, then that's great, because you can grow a lot, or you could maybe like employ even more people now that they're more productive. But if the demand is not elastic, because people just gonna they're gonna eat one loaf of bread a day, and even if you make bread cheaper, they're not gonna eat very much more. Then what you might end up doing is you might end up firing people, or not employing as many in the future, because now you're more effective. So even when innovation is augmenting labor, the impact on wages and the impact on the earning potential of people is still ambiguous, right? So like it really depends on the context, and it depends on what kind of good were you producing, and how much more unsatisfied demand there is for this good, as opposed to not. Because there are some things that you would be happy to consume more of if they were cheaper, and there are some other things that you just don't need more of, even if they're made cheaper. You only need like a pair of jeans per year or something like that.
Any other questions? Somebody else already question? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Is it possible to join your initiative also from Europe? And
yeah,
what is
sure.
what is necessary to be a part of this initiative?
Yes, so we definitely want the initiative to be bigger than just the partnership on AI, because if you think, for example, about the analogy that I was using with environmentally responsible business, this needs to be a global movement, right? Like if just a couple businesses adopt principles around green operations, that's not enough to make any kind of impact. So please get in touch with me on this. Our next steps is right now we're developing a research agenda to make it public, and to actually invite other organizations, researchers, and stakeholders to point out where the gaps are, and to contribute their own research and thinking into the project. But we definitely, we're designing it in a way for both the research to be open for everyone to contribute to, and definitely for the frameworks that we're going to end up recommending to be open for people to also adopt and hopefully test in their own environments and their own organizations.
I just posted your email address. Marcos, next question.
Katya, that's great. So I work in the world of education, which basically, when we talk about attainment and grades and everything, we're really looking at people's ability to memorize stuff and repeat it. But the world is not requiring that much more anymore. We don't need great memory people. What we need is ingenuity, creativity, the ability to communicate, and probably the ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn, which aren't tested in our standardized tests anywhere in the world. Do you see AI moving into that area to really get labor selection into a much better state than it is at the moment?
You mean the matching between people and jobs and like requirements of jobs?
Or even people who are going to create new jobs and new careers and be great investment partners and roles which we don't yet know, good politicians.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're laying out a really important and needed vision. It's not, suddenly I can tell you like, yeah, such and such are doing this today, exactly. But I am very hopeful. I'm also very, very hopeful about AI for education and AI helping to forge individualized learning paths. And, kind of like try to cater to what you're saying, finding and developing the individual talents that only humans can have, and different humans have different, but our education system just doesn't have the capacity to treat them all at an individual level.
Do you see the day when we'll have an AI interview, which will eliminate the requirement for a standardized test?
Oh, that's a great, like, it's actually happening quite a bit already that AI accompanies a human interviewer, or AI screens resumes before, even, you know, to create a stack that the human later looks at. But then, yeah, like there are applications that look at, you know, how you perform on video and try to take into account different signals like gestures and things like that, and predict your future performance on the job based on that. I'm not necessarily going to endorse these technologies as they stand today, but there are a lot of developments in that space. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katya. She has a hard cut, so we have to make sure that she's getting to her next meeting.